research corpus to address that issue. You've identified that some issues about postpartum phenomena might be relevant, as well as other issues about individuals in a person by stressor kind of contextual situation might be relevant. But probably those are going to have to be individualized in this case by interviews or some sort of psychological profile done by someone with either psychiatric or psychological clinical qualifications in that issue to inform the likelihood. Okay, so you're looking for some kind of likelihood statement at the end there. That would be drawn on research, but maybe given by a practitioner. Okay, let's move to the opposite side of the room and start at the back with one of the groups there. Can you tell us if there were any additional issues you identified? I'll need the microphone, or I and others around here are not going to hear you.
Ma'am, what I feel is that because the mother was a single mother and she had 3 triplets to deal with, and the daughter was not mature enough to understand, and therefore she felt that maybe her mother was spending a lot of time with the triplets, she was feeling neglected, and maybe this was a way that she thought she could take whatever she was feeling inside on the kids, and ended up doing that. So that can be a result of the neglect she was feeling.
Okay, so that sort of relates to the sibling rivalry, but also independent of that, you know, maybe just a change in the relationship that had occurred between her and her mother. And what you're looking at there very much is trying to understand what a 7-year-old mindset might be in those circumstances. So as we had some others suggest, maybe a developmental psychologist who could provide those insights would be helpful. You know, I mean, under the law, there are huge legal doctrines here as well that might apply, such as the doctrine of doli incapax, or the lack of responsibility that young children under a certain threshold age might have for any conduct that might otherwise have criminal connotations. So the mental state of the child, you know, might be relevant, it might not, depending on how that doctrine plays out or what the threshold is. So yes, that's going to be an issue in the decision about whether or not anything is pursued regarding the subject. Okay, good. The next group down, any additional issues that were identified? Yes, you want to jump in? Can we get you the microphone? Let's belong to the gentleman here in the row 2, in the middle of row 2. Thank you.
It could have been like not sibling rivalry, but just she wanted to pick her like brothers, and because we have seen like even adults fail to pick child in proper manner, and she was just very curious to pick them again and again, and that's where we see like there were several injuries with other 2 as well. So it could have been that as well, like not sibling rivalry, but daughter of not so like a very young age. She was just trying to pick and fail.
And to be helpful and to role play a mom, you know, or exactly. To, you know, excited by the opportunity of you know, little babies that look like dolls and enjoys dressing them or picking them up or whatever she would do with dolls.
And another possibility can be they themselves, like as her version is that she said he fell out of his rocker 3 times. So they might be falling on their own. And
They might be falling on their own. I think that is quite a curious statement there. And you know, one doesn't know at all whether the 7-year-old has a motivation, you know, to try to create some story about what happened to injure the children, because she knew that she did something that might have injured the babies. That, you know, looking at that sort of possible motivation herself might need some expertise as well regarding her development. Yes, over there.
I was just thinking
the age of the child is 7.5 years. So according to Piaget's cognitive development theory, from 7th year to the 11th year, 12th year, you're moving into the concrete operational stage. That means you're moving from something which is bound to the object to an abstract level. So it is possible, and we have observed that mothers, and especially if the mother is a child care worker, at some point getting the children to be a little more independent is a component of their professional profile. So I'm wondering how the mother would have communicated to her child about being on her own, taking care of the little fellows. So this child, 7.5-year-old child, is thinking of words like watch out, take care, be around. How the child has interpreted them to that is what I would be very interested in looking at. Thank you so much.
And you know, so we have some insight here from somebody who knows more about developmental psychology.
I'm an applied linguist, so the developmental psychology part is a part of our training. Thank you.
Fantastic. And so yes, those communication issues might be very relevant. So I think that's part of this vignette as well. Yes, what did you want to?
On the physical condition of the daughter at the age of 7.5 years, one suggestion made by Jyotsna was of a past experience, like past consequence of bad quote-unquote mothering. But
in other words, has she been found with bruises or?
Yeah, but I see the daughter's condition. I think I've studied this a bit. The condition of gigantism. It's a hormonal imbalance that people have, like someone might have at a very young age, where the corresponding age of 7.5 years and a height of 1.3 meters and the weight and the
Right. No, she's very large. She's, you know, probably out of the normal range.
I'm not sure if the hormonal balances like contribute towards a certain impairment in judgment as well, but she's I think she's suffering from she's in a medical condition, and that could be considered.
Want to explore that as well. Okay, it's definitely an available issue. I wanted to ask whether any of the groups had considered whether you might need medical expertise on the extent to which triplets, while in the womb, injure each other before birth, and whether some of those injuries might simply have been a function of the fact, you know, that they were triplets in a very confined space, and how normal that is, and whether the nature of the injuries on all three of them were compatible with either, as was suggested by one group, you know, just generally the mother abusing them negligently or intentionally, or whether there is an alternative explanation for the injuries on the triplet who died, as well as the other two, because it doesn't seem as if the injury that caused the death is necessarily an isolated one, given the injuries on the others, and how does one account for that? So were there any groups that thought about that? Yes?
We thought of the triplet, like that explanation, but then it wouldn't, I don't know how much would make sense, seeing that being triplets, being prematurely born, there'd be enough information with the hospital on release of these children to be able to
check these details with. I'm sure like there'll be tons of reports which could then be looked at. So that's one that could be looked at. We thought the important thing to look at would be medical evidence to show what type of behavior would be able to cause these injuries, especially in children when you know that skull bones don't join until like a few months after you're born, etc. So you need medical evidence, or at least some sort of scientific study to show you what type of action constitutes an action that could result in such reasonable damage, and if that would be negligent when compared to the behavior of the mother or the daughter.
So you need more about neonatal medicine, which is, not necessarily psychological, but definitely in the medical sphere from specialists to address that. Okay, I think you've produced a very rich lot of ideas and thoughts about how to respond to this, that I think raised a lot of what I would consider to be empirical issues associated with, a fairly standard case. I'm going to tell you that in this case, the mother, given her circumstances, could not afford legal representation. She was appointed a legal aid lawyer who had no experience to speak of at all in dealing with homicide cases. Charges were brought against her, not her daughter. There was no investigation at all of any role by the daughter. And the mother was convicted of negligent homicide and confined in prison for 6 years. And all of her children were removed from her on the basis of the conviction. So that's how this case turned out. There were some concerns that perhaps if she had had better legal representation, a number of the theories and hypotheses that you were generating might have led to a very different outcome in this case for this particular litigant. Yes?
Two kind of comments to make, one, and especially post the information on the verdict. It's like the absolute presumption that the caretaking responsibilities are entirely and exclusively of the mother. The fact that the father could just walk away, the fact that there is just about no social support in place, you don't even see it as any kind of mitigating factor. Is the way in which, the very patriarchal public policy that you have. That is like one of the things which hits me very hard. The other was to do with when we look at defensive insanity issues and the kind of cases which have come before courts in India where the perpetrator is a woman. Every one of them is about how she kind of killed her children. So it's in that whole postpartum phase wherein the children who were kind of and either she jumped into the well with the child and the child died and she survived, or it's the other kind of very much the mother doing things to children and convictions happening and people pleading. But in none of the cases that I kind of have studied did you find that this defense was accepted for the mother. So it sort of seems to run across, and a lot of the cases I was doing were of an earlier period, like early 50s and sort of things, but I don't know when is this case, but if it's a more recent one, it doesn't demonstrate, it demonstrates that not much has changed as far as mothering responsibilities are. And we don't really think that mothers also need support. And when they kind of crack down or crack up, what do you do? When they crack up, you crack down. You don't really think otherwise. And I thought that was, at least for me, very significant. Not just the question of legal representation, but as such that for judges also, they're sort of so limited to a certain kind of legal frame, but the larger issues which are actually staring in the case have just been totally ignored. And I was wondering whether empirical legal studies could possibly push things in a different way.
Right, and I think that's a really important consideration, and one of the reasons that I was interested in using this case study was to highlight the fact that there has been a whole strand of research showing that when people violate the norms for their particular group, they get punished more harshly. So women in particular who violate the stereotype about nurturing motherhood or nurturing mothers, as this mother potentially did, tend to pay a higher penalty than would have been the outcome when there have been controlled experimental studies had this occurred while the father were in the shower, because the same perception of his nurturing responsibilities would not have been driving the fact finders and the judges who presided over this case, which did go through an appeal after her conviction, but everything was simply confirmed on appeal in front of a panel of 3 judges. So it is a recent case, but it raises many of those issues about gender stereotyping and unconscious bias from the fact finders looking at these case facts in terms of the penalty that was observed in the outcome of the case in this particular instance. And so it fit within a body of research that, for example, one of my PhD students had done, looking at maternal filicide and outcomes in those sorts of cases. And you know, you can look at a number of instances of those cases, as well as a host of experimental research done where you manipulate exactly what the circumstances are of the alleged perpetrator and the gender of the perpetrator. And it all has to do with the extent to which we tolerate norm violations from those sorts of stereotypes. So, no, that was exactly the perfect place to end there. All right, so one addition, go ahead.
In addition to what ma'am is saying, how far is it justified to
How far is it justified to hold mother responsible when she's already in medication and in a stressful condition?
So sorry, I'm just not sure I'm following.
How far is it justified to hold mother responsible? In addition to what ma'am said, father is equally responsible. Especially when she is on medication and in a stressful condition.
Well, you know, those are precisely the kinds of social questions and policy questions that might be better informed by data coming from some of the studies showing how we respond to those charges.
I think more than social issues, it is more a legal issue.
You say more legal than social. I think you know, yes, you can certainly say legally,
because when she is not in a state of balanced mind because of maybe stress and again effect of medicine.
But in order to make that legal issue have legs, don't you need some of the social data, you know, to advance that argument and advance that theory? How well can you do in the absence of? You know, so we sort of, you know, if you look, for example, at the past research on battered women syndrome, and the countervailing way in which some of that evidence would lead to different results in the legal system, I don't think that it would have had much success if the legal doctrine were not informed by other research underpinning it. But that's, you know, that's exactly what we're here in this classroom to debate and discuss.
One more issue that can be seen in this case is premature babies are having more possibility of having seizures. So,
they're much more vulnerable.
because when it is
No
mentioned,
question.
when it is mentioned that the girl is saying that this daughter is saying that sometimes she says the baby fell down and sometimes she says she's silent about it. So in that case, if all the 3 babies are affected, so premature babies have more possibility of having seizures.
Absolutely. There are a host of issues here that the lawyers handling this case could have pursued that might have changed the way in which all of the facts were interpreted by the fact finders, and that certainly, I would agree, is one of them.
I had one other point which is kind of following from. It's like if we see it absolutely from a legal perspective, what this case brings out for us in a very major way, how negligence as a legal wrong, whether you want to call it a civil law, but you see it very much as an individual's wrong. The social structures which cause for certain kinds of negligence to happen, we don't take into account at all. And after all, as individuals, when we function within certain social structures, it's literally like it's set up against you. The entire thing is being set up against you, and you're supposed to like surmount it. So I'm not here speaking in terms of not from the feminist lens. Say even if it was a father, and he was taking care of 3 triplets and a daughter, 4. With no kind of support at all. Possibly the patriarchal bias would go in his favor, but the entire inquiry will still happen within the 4 corners of individual responsibility. And is it the right way to look at questions of negligence? In the absence of any kind of support measures, because nobody plans to have triplets. You're just having a second baby and you suddenly have 4. So what that kind of means, we don't even worry about it, we just make it like it is the responsibility of the particular parents who decided to have children. So I just felt that as it really very sharply brings out how when we teach negligence, we are talking about the reasonable person or actually in taught terms the reasonable man. Though it's a woman here, you're not really worrying about what her reasonable standards would be. So I just felt if I could look at it totally from a legal lens, that one would want to research that how we constructed this entire wrong of negligence and what we've done with it.
Well, what I want to do in follow-up to that comment, which I think is really an important salient comment, if I can get my screen. How do I move ahead because it won't go past this? Cancel? There's quite a bit of work that is being done comparing the psycho-legal and the legal emphasis. And one of the dimensions is what you have raised, which is the extent to which individual free will is presumed in the law but controverted by psychological research. And so one of the things that I would argue that psychology does bring to the law is to undercut the individual responsibility, because the circumstances and the impact of circumstances on individual behavior are very well acknowledged and recognized in psychological research. And so in many studies, and I'll find my table contrasting those somewhere here. I think it was that one. Let's see. It's further back. I have a table that outlines those differences that I wanted to look at here. And I called it conflicts between psych and law. And I guess, right at the bottom is where I put this notion that in law there's this emphasis on free will because we hold the individual responsible, and one litigant at a time is a defendant, typically, who is judged in that way, whereas, you know, psychology acknowledges much more the fact that there might not be that individual control because of other circumstantial influences that generate behaviors.
But psychology also still kinds of puts it to the individual. You know, that individual was determined by the individual, and so in some manner you either pathologize, or you infantilize, or you exclude. The point I am making is that if you